I had always dreamed of getting away from the noise of the city, escaping to some isolated cabin in the woods where I could think, relax, and recharge. It had been a stressful year with work and personal issues, and I thought a quiet weekend would be just what I needed. I spent hours researching cabins for rent online, looking for something secluded and peaceful. Finally, I found the perfect place. A small cabin in a remote area of the forest. It looked cozy and private, nestled between towering trees with no neighbors for miles. I booked it right away. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, with the road slowly narrowing as I got farther from civilization. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking out much of the sun. The air was crisp and fresh, a sharp contrast to the city's pollution. By the time I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. It was everything I had hoped for: small, rustic, and surrounded by wilderness. It was the perfect getaway. The cabin itself was charming. It had a wooden exterior with a porch that wrapped around the front. The inside was simple but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a living area with a couch and a couple of chairs. There was a loft bedroom above the main floor. I unpacked my things, set up the small space, and made myself comfortable. The first night was quiet. It was just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt at peace. That first night, I went to bed early, wanting to rest and unwind. But sometime around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint sound. It was a noise that didn't seem quite right. Something soft, almost like a tapping. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound came from outside. I waited, listening, but it didn't come again. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, messing around near the porch. I tried to go back to sleep, but something about the noise stuck with me. The next morning, I brushed off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was being silly. I made a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, taking in the view. The air was cool, the forest around me dense and still. It was beautiful. There was no sign of anyone nearby, and the silence was only broken by the occasional bird call. I spent the day hiking around the property, exploring the nearby trails, and trying to clear my head. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed the area around the cabin felt more and more isolated. It wasn't just that it was far from town. It felt like it was deliberately hidden, as though it had been chosen for its seclusion. I had no idea who owned the land around it, but there was something about the way the trees grew in thick clusters, making it difficult to see far into the distance, that made me feel like I was being watched. That night, I tried to put the previous evening's weird noise out of my mind, but when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I heard it again, a soft, irregular tapping, this time louder and more distinct. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the woods. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing more rhythmic as if someone were knocking on the walls. I felt my heart rate spike. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and carefully walked to the back door, my mind racing. I opened the door slowly, scanning the porch and the surrounding area. Nothing, just the trees, the dark night, and the unsettling silence. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. There was no sign of anyone. I thought maybe the wind was causing the sound, but something didn't sit right. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any footprints or signs of movement, but the ground was hard, covered in a layer of dry leaves that hadn't been disturbed. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was overreacting and went back inside. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I had a headache, and my mind felt foggy, like I hadn't slept at all. I went through the motions of making breakfast, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. I decided to head into town to grab some supplies. I needed a change of scenery, something to break the tension. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints leading up to the front porch. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but upon closer inspection, they weren't. They were fresh, as though someone had walked up to the cabin while I was asleep. I froze for a moment, my stomach tightening. I walked around the cabin to see if the prints continued, but they stopped at the front door. No one was there now, but it was clear that someone had been. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, even though I knew I had locked them the night before. Everything seemed fine, but the feeling of being watched was more intense now. I didn't want to stay in the cabin anymore, but I also didn't want to leave. I had already come so far, and part of me didn't want to let fear control me. I decided to go into town as planned, to clear my head. The town was small, just a few buildings scattered along the main road. I grabbed a few supplies, trying to shake off the creeping feeling that had followed me from the cabin. As I was leaving the store, I ran into a local man who seemed friendly enough. We exchanged a few words, and he asked where I was staying. I told him about the cabin, and his expression changed almost imperceptibly. He quickly followed up with, "Ah, that place. You know, the owner's a bit strange. He doesn't like visitors up there. You might want to be careful." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to be funny, but the look on his face told me there was more to it than that. He gave me a long, lingering look before saying, "You're not alone up there, are you?" Then he turned and walked away without waiting for a response. The rest of the day felt off. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's comment. The idea that the cabin's owner might be watching me made my skin crawl, but I pushed it aside. I was just being paranoid. I needed to focus on relaxing and enjoying the peace I had come for. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the unease hit me again. There was no one around, and the night was still, but something felt wrong. I couldn't place it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. The next few days passed in a blur of strange occurrences. I'd find small things out of place. A chair moved slightly, a door left ajar, the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin in the middle of the night. But when I'd go outside to investigate, there was never any sign of anyone. Still, the sense of being watched never left. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, on the last night, it all came to a head. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book when I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were heavier, more deliberate, coming from the woods just outside the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside once more, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped when I stepped out onto the porch, but I knew someone was out there. I shone the light into the trees, scanning the shadows, but there was no one. I stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath my boots. The air felt thick, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a figure, barely visible through the trees, standing still, watching me. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It just stood there, blending in with the darkness, its outline barely distinguishable from the trees behind it. I don't know what made me do it, but I took a step toward it. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I forced myself forward, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, the figure suddenly turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, the silence of the night closing in around me. It was then that I realized I had never been alone in that cabin. The owner had been watching me, perhaps even coming around every night, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to leave. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, no longer caring about the peaceful retreat I had come for. I didn't want to stick around to figure out who this man was or what his intentions were. I left the cabin behind, driving away as fast as I could, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I never went back to that cabin. I still don't know who the man was or why he was watching me. All I know is that I got lucky, and I got out before things could go any further. It was one of those trips where you're supposed to get away from everything. No work, no stress, just a little peace and quiet out in the woods. I had been craving it, honestly, because life had gotten a little too hectic. A week in a cabin, just me and the quiet of the trees. A chance to breathe again. The cabin was small, nothing fancy, just a little one-room place with a stone fireplace and a creaky front porch. It was off the grid, too, deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. A place where the only sound was the wind and the rustling of leaves. Perfect escape. I had been planning this for months, wanting to disconnect from everything. I packed up some basic supplies, food, my gear, and a few books, and drove out on a Friday morning. The road leading up to the cabin was bumpy, rough, just the way I liked it. It was a good few hours of driving before I reached the place, and by the time I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already sinking low. The last bit of the drive had been down a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the woods, and I had to drive with my lights on full to see where I was going. The air was chilly, even though it was still early autumn, and the smell of pine filled the air as I unloaded my stuff. The cabin itself was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. A small creek ran along one side of the clearing, its sound steady and calming. The kind of place that felt like it could have been untouched for decades. I locked my car and made my way inside. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing the bare essentials inside. Just a simple bed, a kitchen area, and the fireplace. It had a rustic charm to it. I spent the evening unpacking and settling in. I made a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. The cabin had electricity, but it was minimal, just enough to power a few lights and the fridge. After dinner, I sat on the front porch with a drink in hand, watching the last bits of sunlight fade behind the trees. It was peaceful, way more peaceful than I'd expected, honestly. No noise, no people, just the sounds of the forest. As the darkness settled in, the temperature dropped, and I decided to get some sleep. I had a fire going in the fireplace, and the warmth filled the room, making the air inside feel a little more comfortable. The bed was small but cozy, and I could hear the wind howling outside as I lay there, drifting off. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up early, made some coffee, and went outside to stretch my legs. The forest looked different in the daylight, more alive. The trees towered above me, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I decided to take a walk, just to explore the area. There were a few trails around the cabin, and I followed one that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. For hours, I wandered through the forest, listening to the occasional bird or rustling of leaves underfoot. I didn't see much wildlife, just the occasional squirrel or rabbit darting between trees. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own thoughts. The kind of silence you rarely get when you're surrounded by other people. As the sun started to dip again, I made my way back to the cabin. I felt a sense of calm, like everything was just as it should be. That evening, things started to feel different. The air felt thicker, and the wind had a strange edge to it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the chill of the evening. But as I sat on the porch, I noticed something that made me uneasy. A noise in the distance. It wasn't the normal forest sounds. Nothing like the birds or squirrels I'd heard earlier. It was a low, gruff growl, distant but still clear. I froze, listening. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a dog's growl, but deeper, more guttural, like it was coming from something bigger than just an animal. I told myself it was probably just a coyote or something. After all, there were a lot of wild animals in these parts. But the sound wasn't right. It kept going, and I couldn't help but feel a prickle of fear along the back of my neck. It wasn't normal. The growl stopped after a few minutes, and I figured it was just some wild animal moving on. I went back inside and locked the door, feeling a bit foolish for getting spooked. The wind picked up again, and I turned on the lights in the cabin. The fireplace crackled, and I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to get some sleep, but every little sound outside seemed amplified. The wind in the trees, the creaking of the cabin, and even the sounds of the creek were unnerving. At some point, I must have drifted off, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. The next day, I decided to stick closer to the cabin, figuring that maybe I was just overtired or imagining things. I spent the day inside, reading and cooking, just keeping myself busy. But the strange feeling lingered, like I was being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, looking into the trees, but never saw anything. Yet, something told me I wasn't alone. That evening, as the sun began to set again, I noticed something odd. The area around the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet. The wind had died down, and even the normal rustling of the trees seemed to stop. It was too quiet, I couldn't even hear the creak anymore, which was unusual. I stood up and went to the window, peering outside. It was hard to see much with the low light, but I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or a bear, but the shape didn't seem right. It was too tall, too lanky. I couldn't make out any details, but my gut told me something was off. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, determined to figure out what was going on. I moved slowly, staying close to the cabin, scanning the area with the light. My heart was pounding as I stepped into the clearing, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I moved deeper into the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just at the edge of the trees, barely visible, stood a figure. It was tall, at least 7 feet. Its shape was hunched, almost like it was crouching, but its posture was unsettlingly unnatural. The thing had the body of a man, but its limbs were too long, too thin. Its fur was matted and dark, and its face, if you could call it a face, was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out glowing eyes. It was staring directly at me. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then it made a low growling sound, the same sound I had heard the night before. It was louder now, closer, more menacing. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature didn't move, but its eyes never left mine. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, stumbling over rocks and branches in the dark. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I pressed my back against the door, breathing heavily. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something in between, something not quite right. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to steady my breathing. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the noises outside stopped. I didn't hear anything else. No growls, no movement, just silence. But I didn't dare go back outside to check. I stayed up for hours, just watching the door and waiting for something, anything, to happen. By morning, I was exhausted, but the creature, whatever it was, hadn't returned. The sun had risen, and everything seemed normal again. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes after something has happened, something that shouldn't have. I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in that cabin. My hands shook as I loaded my car, and I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they say? I didn't know what it was, only that it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. I didn't go back to that cabin. Couldn't. The woods felt wrong now, haunted by something I didn't understand. Something I didn't ever want to see again. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but feel like the thing, whatever it was still watching me, still out there, lurking in the trees. I had always dreamed of owning a cabin in the woods, a place to get away from the chaos of life and reconnect with nature. So when I finally found one for sale in a remote area, I didn't hesitate. The price was surprisingly low, and the listing didn't mention anything particularly strange about the place. It was a small cabin, a bit worn but charming in its own way. I could already imagine how peaceful it would be to spend weekends there, away from work and the noise of the city. The cabin was located on a piece of land far from the nearest town. It was nestled among tall, dense trees, with only one dirt road leading in. The isolation felt comforting, almost like I was the only person on Earth. The cabin itself was older, but the structure seemed solid. The roof had a few patches, and the paint on the walls was peeling in some places, but that only added to the rustic charm. The first few weeks after I bought the cabin were perfect. I'd spend the days outside, clearing the yard, chopping wood, and getting the place ready for winter. I spent nights by the fire, reading or just enjoying the silence. It was everything I'd imagined, and I was content. But then, something strange happened. I don't know exactly when I started to notice, but there was an odd smell in the cabin one morning. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there. I couldn't place it. Something earthy, almost metallic. At first, I thought it was just old wood or maybe something in the plumbing, but it stuck around, getting worse over time until it became impossible to ignore. I decided to investigate. I checked the attic, thinking maybe there was some kind of rodent infestation. The attic was accessed by a small pull-down ladder that creaked every time it was used. When I climbed up, the air felt musty and cold. I flicked on the light, scanning the dim space. There were old boxes stacked up in corners, cobwebs in the rafters, and a layer of dust on everything. Nothing unusual. But then something caught my eye. There, half hidden under some old blankets, were what looked like human bones. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but when I moved closer, I saw them clearly. A skull still attached to a few pieces of a spine, some ribs scattered around it, and a few other bones I couldn't immediately identify. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These were human remains. I froze. My heart raced in my chest, and my mind scrambled for an explanation. How could this be? Why were there bones in my attic? I stepped back, my legs shaking. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a sick joke or something left behind by the previous owner, but that didn't make sense. No one would leave human bones just lying around in an attic. I ran down the ladder and immediately called the police. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone, but I managed to explain what I had found. The operator was calm but serious, asking me not to touch anything and to wait for officers to arrive. I sat outside the cabin, my mind racing. The isolation that had once felt comforting now seemed oppressive, suffocating. What had I gotten myself into? It took a while for the officers to arrive, but when they did, they immediately took control of the situation. They asked me to stay outside and wait, which I did without question. The police went in, their footsteps muffled by the thick walls of the cabin. I could hear them talking to each other, but I couldn't make out the words. The officers stayed inside for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, they emerged, one of them walking straight up to me. He had a grim expression on his face, and his eyes were filled with a kind of disbelief that I couldn't understand. He told me that the bones were indeed human, and they had likely been there for a long time. They asked if I knew anything about the previous owners, and I told them I didn't know much, just that the cabin had been vacant for years before I bought it. They brought in more officers and started to search the cabin more thoroughly. It didn't take long for them to find something else. In the crawl space under the cabin, they found more bones. Some of them still partially covered in dirt, others stacked in a neat pile. The officers were quiet as they worked, and I could see their faces tightening with the realization that this wasn't just some strange accident. This was something darker, something sinister. One officer, a woman with short brown hair, came over to me and told me that they had already contacted the coroner. She explained that they would be taking the bones to the lab to determine how long they had been there and whether there were any other clues. She didn't say much else, but the look in her eyes was enough to tell me that they suspected something terrible had happened here. The police left a few officers behind to secure the cabin and continued their investigation. I didn't know what to do. I was still reeling from the discovery. How could this be? Was I somehow involved in something illegal without even knowing it? Was this cabin some kind of hidden crime scene? A few days passed, and the police continued their investigation. They took the bones away, and I didn't hear from them for a while. I spent most of that time in a daze, unable to shake the image of the bones in the attic from my mind. I couldn't believe that I had been living in a place where something so horrifying had happened. Finally, a detective came to speak with me. He was a middle-aged man, wearing a suit even though it was clear he wasn't here for a casual chat. He told me that they had managed to identify the bones. Most of them belonged to a man who had gone missing about 5 years ago. They also found traces of a woman's remains in the same area. He explained that the previous owner of the cabin had been questioned, but he had denied any involvement. However, the detectives were certain now. The previous owner, a man named Walter Green, had been running some kind of illegal operation. He had a history of criminal activity, and it seemed that he had used the cabin for something far worse than just a weekend retreat. Green had been arrested for a string of other crimes, and the police suspected that the bones in my cabin were the result of a dark and twisted history of violence. It turned out that he had been involved in human trafficking, and the cabin had been used to store victims before they were transported elsewhere. The police had been investigating him for months, but the discovery of the bones in my cabin was the break they needed to bring him down for good. As the police wrapped up their investigation, they made it clear that I was not involved in any way. The bones had been there long before I ever set foot in the cabin. But that didn't make me feel any better. The thought that I had been living so close to something so monstrous haunted me for weeks. I sold the cabin soon after. The memory of the bones in the attic was too much to bear. It wasn't the dream getaway I had imagined. It was a place tainted by the horrors of the past. I couldn't bring myself to stay there any longer, not even to collect the things I had left behind. The land was cursed in some way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of those past events lingered in the air, invisible but ever-present. The police eventually arrested Walter Green, and he was convicted for his role in the crimes. But it didn't bring me peace. I still think about the cabin sometimes, the smell of decay in the attic, the bones I found, and the terrible history that had been hidden away there for so long. It's a chapter of my life I wish I could forget, but one that will haunt me forever. It was just supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I had been planning it for months, dreaming about the quiet, the isolation, and the chance to clear my head. A little cabin, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Just me, the forest, and the wind through the trees. No one to bother me, nothing to distract me. I could finally take a break and get away from everything. I found the cabin online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small structure tucked deep in the woods, off the beaten path. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. I liked the idea of it. No neighbors, no traffic, just nature and all the time in the world to enjoy it. When I first got there, the place was more isolated than I expected. The cabin was old but solid, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams overhead, and windows that looked out over the forest in every direction. There was a small porch with a swing, perfect for watching the sunset or just enjoying the breeze. I didn't mind the few creaky floorboards or the old smell that lingered in the air. Things like that didn't bother me. I unpacked, set up my things, and then took a long walk around the property, exploring the woods that stretched on forever in every direction. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional bird call, and my own footsteps. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. No distractions, no stress, just the natural world, undisturbed. That night, I made a fire in the fireplace and sat in the armchair by the window. I hadn't expected to feel uneasy, but as the sun sank behind the trees, the world outside started to feel different. It wasn't a sudden shift, just a creeping sensation that settled over me. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by so much dark, dense forest. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge when you're far away from civilization. The fire crackled, and I tried to push the feeling aside. I had brought some books, a journal, and a few movies to pass the time. But every time I settled in, I found myself looking out the window, peering into the blackness beyond. The trees looked different in the dark, their long shadows stretching out like fingers, reaching into the night. It was like the forest was alive, breathing, moving in subtle ways that I couldn't quite place. I tried to sleep that first night, but the creaking of the cabin kept me awake. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound started to feel too deliberate. There were footsteps outside, quiet but distinct, shuffling around the cabin like someone was walking slowly in the yard. My heart raced, and I pressed my back into the mattress, trying to stay as still as possible. The footsteps came and went, and then I heard the faint sound of something scratching against the walls. I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't sound like an animal, but at the same time, it didn't sound like a person either. The wind could play tricks on you, sure, but this felt too real. It was the kind of thing that could make your skin crawl if you listened too long. I got up and checked the locks on the door and windows. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, By the time morning came, the air felt heavy with silence. It was like the entire world was holding its breath. I convinced myself that it had been nothing more than the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, this place was isolated. There was no one for miles, no one who could have made those sounds. And yet, deep down, I wasn't so sure. I spent the next day hiking, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The trees were thick, the forest dense and quiet. But even out there, it didn't feel the same. Felt too still. The birds weren't singing as much. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching through the underbrush, the occasional rustle in the leaves, and the faint whisper of wind through the trees. It was unnerving, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. I built another fire, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept the doors and windows shut tight, even though the heat from the fire made the cabin feel stuffy. My nerves were on edge. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind, the crackling of the fire, the occasional squeak of the cabin settling. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something watching me from the dark, just beyond the tree line. But when I looked, all I saw was blackness. That night, the noises came again. This time, there were no footsteps, just a soft tapping, like something was knocking at the door. Not a loud bang, but a quiet, insistent rapping. I froze, my pulse racing in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The knock came again. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the front door or the side of the cabin, but it was close, too close. I wanted to get up, to check the door, to see if someone was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something inside me told me that if I did, I wouldn't like what I found. The tapping stopped after a while, but I still couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal, person, or something else entirely? I stayed awake, listening, watching, my eyes darting around the cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light casting flickering shadows across the room. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the cabin felt different, felt emptier somehow. The silence was even heavier than before. I made breakfast, forcing myself to stick to my routine, to do something normal, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, like someone or something was always just out of sight. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I read, I hiked, I tried to enjoy the stillness of the place. But by the time the sun started setting, I knew I couldn't stay another night. The noises, the sense of being watched, the unnatural quiet. It was all too much. I packed my things, ready to leave, but as I started to head out the door, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, just outside the window, in the growing darkness, I saw a figure standing by the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, slow, deliberate steps, the shape tall and dark against the forest backdrop. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure was unmistakable. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a shadow. It was something else, something far more menacing. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and I ran to my car. The headlights cut through the dark as I sped down the narrow dirt road, my heart hammering in my chest. As I left the woods behind me, I didn't look back. The cabin, the forest, everything I'd felt in those few days stayed with me long after I was gone. Looking back now, I still don't know what it was. I never found any tracks or signs of anyone being out there, but I know what I saw. And the feeling that something was watching me, that's something I'll never forget. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks or if there was something more to it, but I do know that I'll never go back there again. The woods are beautiful, but sometimes the silence is the loudest thing of all, and the things hiding in it, better left undisturbed. I've always loved my cabin. It's tucked away in a small, isolated area in the woods, far from the noise and clutter of city life. For me, it's always been a sanctuary, a place to get away from the world and recharge. My family built it years ago, and ever since, I've spent countless weekends there. I love the solitude, the quiet mornings, and the peaceful evenings. There's something calming about being surrounded by nature, hearing nothing but the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant call of wildlife. But for all the comfort it brings, there are times when the isolation feels heavier, and the woods seem less like a sanctuary and more like a vast, looming presence. I'd been there alone for a few days. It was just the right kind of trip. Peaceful, restful, with no distractions. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground as I made myself dinner in the cabin's small kitchen. The air was crisp, typical for the fall, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Felt good to be away from everything. I sat down at the small wooden table, eating my meal, listening to the soft sounds of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I wasn't scared, at least not yet. After I finished eating, I washed up the dishes, making sure to keep the kitchen clean. The evening was still, and the air outside was starting to cool. I went to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. The shadows were long now, stretching far across the yard, and the night sky was clear, with just a few stars visible through the branches. There was something about that kind of silence, the kind that wraps around everything like a heavy blanket. It wasn't unnerving, but it made me feel aware of everything, like I could hear every twig snap or leaf fall. I decided to get some firewood. It wasn't too far from the cabin, maybe 100 yards, but the woods were dense, the kind of forest where the trees felt thick enough to swallow up any sound. As I walked out, the smell of pine and damp earth hit me. The ground was soft underfoot, the leaves and moss giving way slightly with each step. I made my way to the woodpile, which was tucked between two large oak trees. I grabbed a few logs, stacking them carefully in my arms. The woods were oddly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of everything. I felt the weight of each log, but more than that, I felt the weight of the night pressing in. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no distant animal calls. Felt like everything had gone still, and I didn't like it. I turned to head back to the cabin when I heard something. It was faint, at first, like a low murmur that didn't belong. I froze. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, just the sense that there was something out there. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or something small, but the longer I stood there, the more the feeling gnawed at me. I took a few steps back toward the cabin, but my mind wouldn't let me shake the feeling. Something was off. I looked around, scanning the trees. There was nothing, just darkness and shadow. The silence wrapped itself tighter around me. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was nothing. But that feeling, like someone was watching me, clung to me. I quickened my pace, hurrying back to the cabin. But when I reached the door, I didn't immediately go inside. I stood there for a moment, staring into the woods. That's when I heard it again. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking, but the sound was too loud, too close. My heart jumped, and I instinctively took a step back, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I listened, my breath catching in my throat. It was quiet again, too quiet. I didn't know if I should go inside or investigate, but the urge to find out what had made that noise was overpowering. I stepped out into the yard again, trying to remain as calm as I could. My eyes swept the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The sound hadn't been close enough to be a threat, but I knew something was there. I felt it. I decided to make my way around the cabin, keeping an eye on the woods as I walked. I didn't have a weapon, nothing more than a small pocket knife that I always carried with me. Not much for defense, but it made me feel a little safer. I reached the back of the cabin, where the woods were thickest. The only light came from the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the forest floor. There was a clearing ahead, and as I made my way toward it, I noticed something. Footprints, fresh ones. The earth was soft here, and there were clear impressions of shoes, boots most likely. They were large, heavier than my own. I felt my stomach drop. These were human tracks. I stood frozen, trying to calm myself. It didn't make sense. My nearest neighbors were miles away. No one came to visit, and there were no signs of anyone being here before. I crouched down, examining the prints. They seemed to lead deeper into the woods. I considered following them, but every instinct in my body told me that was a bad idea. I had no idea who or what had left them, and the fact that they were so recent made everything worse. I backed away slowly, my eyes glued to the tracks, until I reached the cabin again. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. For the first time that night, I felt real fear creeping in. The silence that had been so peaceful earlier was now suffocating. It was too quiet. I lit the fireplace again, hoping the warmth and the crackling fire would calm me down. I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening. Every small sound outside, the wind shifting the trees, a twig snapping, made my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I decided to go to bed, pulling the thick quilt over myself. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise kept me awake. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything, that would explain the unease gnawing at me. I don't know how long I lay awake before I heard it. A knock, faint at first but unmistakable. A single, deliberate knock. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Came again, this time louder. Someone was knocking on the cabin door. I didn't move, couldn't. I lay there, listening to the soft, steady knocks, my breath shallow. It wasn't a casual knock. It wasn't a neighbor or someone lost in the woods. It felt purposeful. I didn't have a phone with me. There was no reception out here. I was completely isolated. The knocking stopped suddenly, and all I could hear was my own breathing. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. I debated going to the door, but every part of me screamed not to. I didn't want to see what or who was on the other side. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep. Morning came eventually, and I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, peering out the windows, but the forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The footprints were still there, deep in the woods, but I didn't go out to check again. I packed up quickly. I didn't bother staying another night. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me. I didn't tell anyone about the knocking or the tracks. I didn't think they'd believe me, and part of me wasn't sure I believed it either. But I never went back to that cabin alone. Not after that. The woods, which once felt like home, now seemed like a place I'd rather avoid. And every time I think about it, I still feel that lingering unease, as if something is out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off, My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened. No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. I always looked forward to my time at the hunting cabin. It wasn't much, just a small structure tucked away deep in the woods, but it was mine. I'd built it myself piece by piece, taking years to get it to a point where I could spend time there without feeling like I was slumming it. It was rustic, with rough-hewn timber walls and a small, sturdy fireplace that kept the whole place warm during the colder months. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air whenever I opened the door, a reminder that this place was my retreat, far from the noise of everyday life. The cabin was nestled in the middle of a thick forest, surrounded by trees that stretched high into the sky, blocking out much of the sun during the day. The only way to get there was through a rough, winding dirt road that took a good hour to drive. There was no one around for miles, and that was exactly how I liked it. Most of the time, I'd come up here alone. It was a place to clear my head, think, and if the mood struck me, hunt a little. No pressure, just peace. I'd been up there for about a week, enjoying the solitude when things started to feel different. It started with small things. Noises I couldn't quite place, branches cracking when the wind wasn't blowing, and the odd sensation that I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. You get jumpy when you're alone for too long, right? It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The first night I heard something unusual. I was sitting in front of the fireplace, flipping through an old hunting magazine. The night was still, and the air was crisp, with a slight chill creeping in from outside. The cabin creaked and groaned as it always did, but something felt off. A sudden rustling sound broke the silence, coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to repeat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I grabbed my rifle and quietly walked to the window. I peered through the thick curtains, but all I could see was the dark expanse of trees and the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the leaves. Nothing. I stood there for a few minutes, straining my eyes, but the forest remained still, quiet. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging around. I sat back down, but the unease didn't leave me. I tried to focus on the fire, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to go for a walk. I needed to shake off that feeling. The woods were my domain. I knew every trail, every bend, every ridge. But as I walked, something felt off. The air was thicker, the silence louder. I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt, large and wide, unlike any animal I'd ever seen before. They didn't look like deer tracks or bear prints. They were too deep, too wide. I crouched down to get a closer look, my fingers brushing the earth. The prints were recent and they led deeper into the woods. I didn't like the direction they were going. Still, I followed them, though every step I took felt heavier, like the forest was pushing against me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching. The tracks led me to a small clearing, one I hadn't been to in years. The trees around it were thick, their branches weaving together to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The clearing was quiet, eerily so. In the center of the clearing, I found something strange. A small, makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves, arranged in a way that didn't look natural. It looked too deliberate, too out of place in the middle of the woods. My pulse quickened as I examined it. Whoever had built this shelter knew what they were doing, and they hadn't gone far. I didn't stay long. Primal instinct kicked in, telling me to get back to the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned around, suddenly aware that I was no longer alone. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by the rush of blood in my ears. I walked faster, almost running, until I finally broke through the trees and saw the familiar outline of my cabin. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. As I approached, I noticed something else. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make my stomach twist. I hadn't left it open. I hadn't even gone near it. My rifle was still strapped to my back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was now inside my cabin. I approached cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The cabin was still, but there was something different about it. The air felt thick, charged with tension. My eyes scanned the room, taking in everything. The fire was out, the logs in the hearth cold and lifeless. Everything seemed untouched, but something wasn't right. It was too quiet. I moved towards the back of the cabin, where the small window faced the woods. The curtain was drawn back slightly, just enough for someone to peek through. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left the curtain like that. I was sure of it. I checked the rest of the cabin, moving quickly from room to room. Nothing had been disturbed, but the unease continued to grow. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being hunted, like the cabin was no longer my safe haven but a trap. That night, I kept the lights off, the door locked, and my rifle close. The fire was out, but I didn't dare try to light it again. Couldn't relax. I kept hearing things, scratching at the door, soft footsteps just outside the window. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd freeze, straining my ears to catch the sound again. But it was always silent when I checked. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. My mind was a blur of exhaustion and fear, but I had to get out of there. I packed my things, making sure to keep my rifle close. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a brief sense of relief. The sun was up, the birds were singing, and the woods seemed almost peaceful again. I made it to the truck without incident, but as I drove down the rough road that led back to civilization, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the winding road and the endless trees behind me. It wasn't until I got home that I realized something important. There had been no sign of the tracks I'd followed, no evidence that anyone had been out there at all. The shelter in the clearing had vanished, as if it had never been there. The whole thing didn't make sense, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not until I figured out what had really happened in those woods. Something out there had been watching me, and it wasn't human.